All right, guys, here we go. I was just on my YouTube, what is it, recommended page, For You page, whatever. And I happened to see this thumbnail here of Matt Walsh and Hunter Avallone. And I was like, oh man, I kind of want to watch this. It's called A Random YouTuber Tried to Debate Me. Very interesting. Frankly, two of the most feminine people I've ever seen in my life. Am I right? Feminine men, am I right? I'm just being a little silly. Just being a little silly. But let's watch the video. Let's get it going. Wow. Sad face.
Today we cancel someone named Hunter Avallone.
Oh, is that what that means? He cancels somebody? Oh, that's a okay, interesting. I don't know. I did. Okay.
He's apparently a YouTuber and Twitch streamer with a moderately large following, though I'd never heard of him. It came to my attention.
Throwing shade at him.
Thanks to a clip posted to Twitter by Addison Smith of OAN. And what came to my attention is that Hunter posted
One American Network, right? Yeah, I think so. Bro, if you watch that, I feel bad for you. I don't know.
a lengthy video to his YouTube channel reacting to my testimony in front of the Tennessee House Committee about their now passed legislation banning child gender transitions. Hunter is apparently
I have no idea about that too much.
Apparently a big fan of child castration. He's a fierce advocate of castrating children. And so, as we'll see, he...
Oh, my God. So here, let me just give you like a general understanding of people who are in support of like transitioning for children. First of all, obviously very uncomfortable topic, right? I don't think ideally anybody wants to introduce hormone blockers or anything to a child, right? Because that's, you know, they're young. It's difficult for them to make a decision that lasts the rest of their life. It's a tough call. But here's how I put it, right? Is that if I had a kid, what would I do? Now, if I'd say I had a kid and they were 4 years old and they're like, oh, dad, let's say they were like born a boy and they're like, I'm a girl. I'd be like, okay, relax. I probably would just ignore them. They're 4 years old. What do they know? And then as time went on, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, they just continue to say like, oh, I'm a girl. And maybe they even gravitated more towards girl stuff, right? And by like the time they hit puberty, like 11, 12, they start getting like severely distressed going through puberty. Obviously, I'm going to take them to a mental health counselor, right? And if that person says, oh, I think your child has gender dysphoria, I'm going to take them for a second and maybe even a third opinion. And if I get 3 doctors that say your kid has gender dysphoria and they're going to have a significant amount of distress if they transition, what else am I supposed to do? I got to do what's best for my kid. And if that's what 3 doctors are telling me, then that's what I'm going to have to do. Because at the end of the day, I don't like... It's an uncomfortable topic, but I want my kid to be happy. And you might be like, well, that's a decision that they, you know, for the rest of their lives. And so you're right. But what do you want me to tell you? You know, is it fully reversible? I mean, it gets less reversible as time goes on, of course. You know, the puberty blockers seem to be pretty reversible. But if they continue that transition, they block their puberty and then maybe at like, you know, they go on hormones at some point. And then, what am I supposed to do, man? I want my kid to be happy and I want them to be healthy. And I try to look at it from that perspective. And if me telling no to my kid over and over again just makes them more and more upset and distressed and potentially want to ride down a slide in the sewer, what am I supposed to do, man? It's a choice that I hope I never have to make. That's pretty much it. You know, I understand that there might be some people who like want to have a trans kid. They're like, oh my God, you said like maybe they have like a boy who just likes finger paint or some their fingernail stuff. And the boy's like, oh, I like painting my fingernails. And maybe the parents like, no, you're a girl. And then they start like conditioning them. That's ridiculous. Obviously, you shouldn't do that. But, you know, like if your kid's showing these symptoms for years and years and years and years and years, and you have mental health professionals saying this thing, what am I supposed to do, bro? Like, I want my kid to be happy and healthy. And so that's how I look at it. You know, there are mental health professionals who study this very closely. And so I try to leave it up to the professionals. So.
Yeah, doesn't like me very much. Here's the clip that was on Twitter. It's very short. Check it out.
Adolescent children. As far as surgeries, you know,
Wait, giving kids the puberty blockers after they've been confirmed gender dysphoric and they've consented and their therapists have consented and their doctors have consented and their parents have consented and they've been persistent in gender dysphoria for a minimum of 6 months. Yeah, that's actually a good thing, Matt.
Oh, I feel like we didn't get enough. I feel like we didn't get enough context because all Hunter is saying there is like, yeah, if you have like 5 different parties and they're like, oh, this is the right way to go,
Women.
then that's a good thing, Matt. I think that it's probably, I don't know. It's one of those things where you're obviously not going to be able, I mean, you're starting from the end. You know, if you're somebody who doesn't affirm trans people, that's going to mean nothing to you, right? That's kind of where it comes from. But
6 whole months, you say? Well, we all know that no child would outgrow a phase after 6 months. 6 months is when it's set in stone. I have never seen my own kids be interested in something or go through a phase that lasts 6 whole months.
Yeah, I mean, like, here's the thing. The difference is that you have, like, medical professionals, like, diagnosing this. And I think that it's fair to be skeptical, by the way. It's perfectly fair to be skeptical. Oftentimes, conservatives will point to a very flawed study that basically says that, like, everything goes back to, like, normal if you don't do anything for people that are diagnosed with gender identity disorder. And the reason is because gender identity disorder was historically over diagnosed drastically, and so that's a false study that conservatives point to. But the problem is that, like, that's how we used to treat this particular issue. Then we phased that out and we, you know, instituted like gender dysphoria. We're always learning, and it's unfortunately there's an experimentation process, and there's going to be some people who detransition, and sometimes when people who with detransition come forward and talk about their experience, we tend to, as a society, shut them down, or at least online, because it's transphobic to talk about detransitioners, and then unfortunately we don't get to have the honest conversations here. But yeah, it's just kind of a mess, you know?
Like, in 6 months, this is their identity now. Might as well chemically castrate them, right? What else are we supposed to do?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, we could do exactly what we had already been doing for all of human history up until 18 seconds ago. We could just let kids go through their phases, let them grow out of it, instead of locking them in place and turning an awkward moment into a lifelong identity crisis.
Maybe. I think it's a little more than that. I don't. It's hard to. I've tried to articulate it because kids do go through phases for sure, but at the end of the day, you have like literal mental health, an identification of like a mental health issue across the board by people who have, you know, doctorate degrees, who do studies for years and years and years and years, and identify behaviors that could be potentially harmful to oneself if some individuals don't transition in a safe, secure way. And we're boiling that down to like just kind of a phase. And I think that it's probably more than a phase. There are probably some people who it is just a phase, and maybe they get misdiagnosed. But most likely most people it's a real thing that's identified. You know, I'm not saying don't question doctors. I'm just saying that there's a reason that they're doctors, and maybe take a little bit more into consideration what they're telling you.
We could do that. But before we get too far in addressing Hunter's points, we should be fair and get the entire context. I had a little bit of a back and forth with him on Twitter yesterday, where he fleshed out his argument, such as it is. He explained that children can consent to these, quote, treatments because the parents and doctors also consent. I asked, how does the consent of the adult somehow validate the consent of the child?
I mean, it does, to the most part. If let's get away from sexual consent, because that's a totally different thing. But like generally speaking, consent, like the parent will consent for a kid. Like your parent can will have your kid consent to going to school and things like that. Like that's what the whole thing. Kids are usually need their parents. Like that's why you have permission slips, right? The parent has to consent. You know what I mean? Like it's a big part of growing up as your parents dictating a lot of your choices, and then as you get older, they dictate fewer and fewer until you become a legal adult. I think we know that, right?
In other words, if a child cannot consent to making permanent life-altering decisions, how does the consent of the adult around the child change that? And he responded that he's only talking about puberty blockers, not the cross-sex hormones or surgeries. In fact, he clarified that hormones and surgery should wait until the child turns 18, according to, in his opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But puberty blockers are different because they are a life-saving medical intervention, he claimed.
It could be. I think sometimes people are a little disproportionate. I do think that there's going to be a significant amount of distress for some of these young people if they don't get it. Sure, probably.
He also noted that I am an ape and I should go F myself.
Damn. No. I think there's a little bit of love between these two.
When I asked how it could ever be appropriate to chemically castrate a child, which is what the puberty blocker does, he answered this. Quote, firstly, too much Tylenol can kill you. They aren't death pills. Puberty blockers can be detrimental if given in large doses, but beneficial when given in proper doses. Why is this so hard for your chimp brain to grasp?
Why? Just chimp brain. Oh my God.
Medicine can be good. Too much medicine can be bad. He later insisted again, smaller.
I wanted to see. Secondly, I think permanent surgery should be held off until 18. Ideally,
doses of puberty blockers are not chemical castration. I'm fine with puberty blockers for minors. Surgery and hormones shouldn't be given until unless 18 years or older.
So the reason that Matt continuously calls like puberty blockers chemical castration is because they give that to some people to chemically castrate them, because I think it like reduces your ability to whatever make spermies or whatever. That's why he says it. But in smaller doses, it would be something that would just hold your puberty back.
Go back to being the creepy
Do I think that Matt Walsh should be scared of the 6 Paths of Pain? I think so, yeah.
dude hanging outside the high school, you degenerate scum.
What the fuck? Why is he so angry? Holy moly. Is Hunter a trans?
I had to ask about 3 or 4 times for any evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving, as he claimed. And finally, after furiously Googling for whatever random studies he could find, but certainly not read, he responded, quote, "Sure, I've attached some evidence below."
Okay, it's a .gov, so I have to go look at this. Oh, come on. He uses he uses the R slur. Bro, I will say, I think it's like hypocritical to me to advocate for one group of people while basically shitting on another group of people. That'd be like calling the guy the fucking N-word because he didn't agree with your LGBTQ stance. Like, I'm just saying, like, oh, since you're too, like, it's a slur. Why are we not beyond this? It's so, not for nothing, but like when you post stuff like this, so first of all, it's a slur. That's just a matter of fact. I always bring up the context that like my wife's a behavioral specialist. Like we have very in-depth conversations about people, specifically people with intellectual developmental disabilities that are higher support needed, not individuals like myself who I have ADHD or people with incredibly, for lack of a better term, high functioning autism where it doesn't super impact their life nearly as much as somebody who lives in a group home who say like, oh, you could say the word, I have this. It's not, if you're like, for people, if you talk to people in a group home, they don't like the word, it upsets them, it offends them deeply. It is a slur, and it's just bothersome that like there's this cognitive dissonance. Oh, you can't say the N word, can't say the F slur, can't say the T slur, can't say any, but the R slur, it's okay to diminish people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It bothers me. So from the first point, you're just being hypocritical by using the word. Second of all, it doesn't make you look good to the mainstream when you're a bunch of dumb fucking, and I'm sorry for being like this is obviously like a hot topic for me, but when you're acting like a dumb fucking I'm the based fucking liberal. I love using the R slur because it makes me more relatable to conservative kids. Like I don't know. It's just a hateful word, and people like to use hateful words to make them feel better about themselves. That's all it boils down to. That's all it is. That word makes you feel strong because it's such an incredibly loaded word. That's loaded with like a lot of historical oppression of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who were systematically or put in institutionalized, neglected, tortured, raped, and abused. I just think it's a bad idea, and it just looks bad to the greater society. So now you have a liberal that's calling Matt Walsh the R slur, and you just makes you look worse when anybody reads that. Like an actual person, not some terminally online dumb fucking kid that loves being edgy, but like actual real people in the real world go like, oh, you shouldn't say that. So it's wrong based on your own moral identification, but then it also makes you look worse. So like, there's no positive to it. Yeah. So.
Since you're too retarded to read yourself, firstly...
Sorry, he read it. I didn't expect Matt to read it.
There's a cohort of trans people over 40 plus years showing that no increase of suicide was present after transition.
What?
Although the suicide risk remained higher, this was due to social issues, not transition. Secondly, here's a study which found that puberty suppression and affirmation care was correlated with a 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts.
Probably should have led with the second one.
So again, go F yourself, you pathetic ape man. Okay, so now everyone's up to speed. A few points, Hunter. First of all, you appear to be about 13 years old, but as far as I know, you're actually a full-grown man, technically, which means that you should understand by now that a weak argument doesn't become strong just by tacking an insult onto the end of it. Actually, that makes your weak argument look even weaker, and it makes you look like a child in the process, and this is a special problem for you since you already look like a child.
Okay.
And if you are going to go the insult route, you probably don't want to throw terms like degenerate around. Remember, you're the one in this conversation passionately defending the right of a doctor to give a child the same drug they use to chemically castrate sex offenders.
Okay.
I'm on the...
Hey, listen, you know that they use Viagra to increase heart flow in babies sometimes? It'd be crazy how weird some pills are. I know that sounds crazy, but I was talking to my mother. She's like, yeah, I have a friend, and they needed to get like prescribed like basically Viagra for their kid in a very low dose because apparently it helps your heart like circulate blood or something like that. I'm not super educated on it. I'm like, that's crazy. And apparently the fact that it works to, keep you, strong, it was actually unintentional originally. So it's just crazy.
anti-child castration side discussion, you're on the pro side. So you're free to stake out that ground if you want, but you are unfortunately precluded from ever calling anyone else a degenerate ever again in your entire life. Second, I'm afraid that I'm not impressed by the ability to Google a study that confirms whatever conclusion you already landed on and then fling it at the other side after briefly skimming the abstract. Okay, it's not how you win an argument. You don't just go to Google, studies that
hold on. I'm trying to find the...
briefly skimming the abstract. Okay, it's not how you win an argument. You don't just go to Google, studies that confirm what I already believed. Oh, here's one. See? The problem with the study food fight is that two can always play at that game, and in this case, I can play it better. Okay. I have, for example, the most thorough study ever conducted on this subject, which spanned 30 years and found that suicidality is...
Oh, he's referencing a Sweden study that only referenced 346 people, and that was gender identity disorder. It wasn't gender dysphoria. I know it from the 30 years because it was from 1973 to 2003. His study is not thorough. It's actually a bad study. I already referenced this study. Again, gender identity disorder, it was overdiagnosed. That's what he's referencing. I already know it from the jump. That's the definite. I don't know. I'm looking for Hunter's sources right now on here to see what he's looking through. But I'll tell you, the one that Matt Walsh is specifically referencing is outdated and it's discredited. I just need you to understand that. And in fact, I used it as a way to be skeptical of it because, like I said, it was gender identity disorder, not gender dysphoria. We're still learning how to deal with these processes. But his study is wrong. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Highest for trans people 10 to 15 years after medical transition. Highest. You, on the other hand, have one study that focuses on people who transition as adults, not as children, and which, according to you, found that there was no increase in suicide rate. Not that there was a notable decrease, but that there was no increase.
Well, I think he had one that said that there was a 77% decrease in the thoughts. The problem is, Matt, here's a big problem. Let's say you're like, well, Papa God, I don't believe you. Okay, that's fair. How come Matt hasn't referenced the study? Become a Daily Wire member. Like and subscribe. YouTuber and streamer attempted to debate me. Watch the full episode. Stop giving money to corporations. Is this is it okay, it's not in there. Watch my hit documentary, Represent Sweet Baby Gang. Okay. Interesting. Cool Kids Club. Blah, blah. There's nowhere in here. There's no pinned comment at all that tells you what he's using. So there's a lot. So fundamentally speaking, even if you don't agree with me, there's a lack of transparency from Matt Walsh, and I found the Hunter articles. They're here. Matt Walsh's fundamental argument is you just found studies that agree with you, and I have a better study that's, by today's standards, 20 years old that observed over 30 years prior to that, up until that point, to 2003, and we are severely behind on mental health in general. And so, we still don't even understand the brain fully. My only point is that Matt gave us nothing and just said, LOL, you're wrong. That's pretty much it.
Increase. And that the suicide rate was still much higher than the general population. Now, you blithely declare that this higher rate of suicide...
And right there, of course, it's going to be higher than the general population because they're still trans and they still struggle. The reduction of suicidality doesn't mean that it's completely gone.
Was due to, quote, social issues, not the transition. Because, you somehow know why all these people killed themselves?
Well... I will say that it's a factor when you have even if you think let's say you don't think that Dylan Mulvaney, we'll use them, is really trans. I do. They genuinely think that they're trans, and there's a constant bully campaign to just completely mock and destroy this person. That's what trans people go through on a general daily basis, especially if they're not passable. I mean, bro, listen. Imagine somebody who's not the most passable woman going anywhere. People are going to stare and look and go, what the fuck is that? And I think that's horrible and rude. But that there's definitely that factor. I'm a fat guy and I feel a little self-conscious going to the gym. You know what I mean? Because sometimes maybe people make fun of me for being, listen, let me tell you something, okay? I went to an Asian sushi buffet yesterday, okay? I went there. And I walk in, and they sat my wife and I down at the table. Okay, now we're two people. They sat us down at a 4-person table. Okay, we sit down. They push another 2-person table up to our table. So we had our 2 seats in the middle, and then 2 seats on either side, and he's like, now you have enough room. I mean, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm laughing because it's funny. And no offense, but I know Asian people aren't a big fan of fat people sometimes. It's okay. God bless. God bless. Okay. But then I'm laughing, but then I'm like, I feel a little silly now because now I feel stupid because there's people around us too, and I feel a little silly. That's how I feel as a fat person. I couldn't imagine being like trans and like, getting, very considerate staff. Absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe they were being considerate, still makes me feel a little silly. But trans people definitely get bullied. There's definitely a social factor. So yeah.
How do you know that? Well, you made it up, of course. And whatever the reason for the suicides, the fact remains that the suicide rate is still very high. And so that would...
It doesn't matter. It's still being high doesn't mean that it doesn't help mental health wise. It being high, but lower than it used to be before transition means that you bettered in outcomes, just so you know. And that's why Matt's using very intentionally manipulative language.
A pretty good indication that the transition meant to prevent that outcome failed to prevent it.
No.
And this is a study you provided to prove your point. People are raving about Genucell skincare. Jessica.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
From Huntsville, Alabama says, my skin looks so...
All right, I'm not going to watch the ad. It's a lot of ad.
Give another study which claims /WalshYT, Genucell...
Yeah, so I'm going to link this study in the bio, but this is the study that Matt Walsh is referencing. It's a 30-year study, long-term follow-up of transsexual persons undergoing sex and reassignment surgery. That's also a dated term. I'm pretty sure, I know that somewhere in here it's going to say gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder as well. I've read this study like 18,000 times. The treatment for transsexualism is a sex assignment, including hormonal treatment and surgery aimed at making a person's body as congruent with the opposite sex as possible. There is a dearth of long-term follow-up studies. Yeah. So this is like the study that starts in 1973 and ends in 2003. I guess it was published in 2011. Yeah, 1970 to 2003. 324 people, which isn't a lot. Watch birth year, sexual reassignment. Yeah, there's a lot of dated terms in here. We didn't have as much mental health focus. That's why newer studies are generally going to be better. I'm going to link Hunter Avallone studies in here as well. Which are, I'm going to look into them, but I'm assuming this one's from 1972 to 2017, so it's a little bit more recent in its like scope. I don't know when this one's from. I still have to look into it. So this is stuff that I think is somewhat new in general. All like the conversation around this, and there's going to need to be more and more studies. Like we don't, in general. But right here. Gender identity disorder, which was something that was gotten rid of because it was overprescribed. Right. So just something to keep in mind. At this point, I think that's something to keep in mind. It's also something to keep in mind that Matt Walsh didn't link his study I would say intentionally because it's a weak study and it's not a particularly good one.
.com/WalshYT. You also give another study which claims these findings, and I'm reading now. Quote, in this prospective cohort of 104 trans and non-binary youths aged 13 to 20 years, receipt of gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones, was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality. Okay, well, at least this one pretends to actually prove your point rather than directly refuting it like the other one. But do you know anything else about this study? Like who funded it? How was it conducted? How did they find their study subjects? How did the research...
Well, can I ask you the same question about the study you're referencing?
Researchers guard against things like selection bias? Did they rely entirely on self-reported data? Do you understand how infamously unreliable self-reported data is? How do they quantify suicidal thoughts? A 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts. How do you quantify that to begin with? Of course, you haven't considered any of this, but it doesn't really...
The only thing that's funny is that if Matt Walsh gave us like, hey, it was funded by Herbert Schmungus, and that guy loves to jerk off to trans porn every day, so maybe it's biased, I would be like, oh, okay. maybe there's a point there. Maybe that shows a bias because Herbert Schmungus loves trans people and he likes to beat his meat to it. But all Matt Walsh did is give you vague skepticisms, which is fair, that you could apply to his context or his study as well. So Matt doesn't really do anything here. Matt overly affirms the study that he believes in as he goes, LOL, you just found a study that you believe in, and then gives a general criticism that could be applied to his study as well. The difference between these two studies is that one is more recent, right? This is a .gov site. I'm going to say that's probably pretty credible. This is one of the things that Hunter put out there. And then this is a journal site from, I don't know who JAMA Network is, right? And then this is a .gov site as well. This is a .gov site as well, with what Matt Walsh gave us as well. This is what he's referencing, right? So here's the problem. I would say that if you're the source you're looking at, which this is Matt Walsh's source from the 2000 or 1973 to 2003. If this is the one that you're referencing, and it's done by the same institution as the one that he's that Hunter's referencing, but his is more recent to 2017 instead of 2003. By this logic, his more updated study is probably more right. They're done by the same, I'm assuming, same institute. Maybe I don't understand the more intricacies, but it's probably fair that if it was published in this .gov website, that they're both fairly credible. The issue with the credibility of Matt Walsh's is that it ended in 2003. We phased out gender identity disorder because it was overprescribed and it wasn't the proper diagnosis anymore. So that's something to keep in mind, fellers.
Really matter because there's a fatal problem here. Well, there's a lot, but let's just focus on one.
Okay.
And it's the same one shared by nearly every study claiming to prove that gender-affirming care has positive results. The problem is this, and you would know this if you read the thing that you Googled, which next time you should think about doing that.
Okay.
The results are based on a 12-month follow-up. Okay. They report that these kids, 12 months after beginning the transition, say that they feel better. You know what that tells us? You know what it proves?
Which one is that?
Absolutely nothing. Not one single thing.
It does prove. It shows that it has a short-term, or maybe, I guess you could say short-term outcome. If your argument is, I don't think it's long-term enough, that's a fair criticism. The problem is that's in the second paragraph what he's referencing, so he probably got that far, said this is all I have to do in my video to apply skepticism, or probably, frankly, disproportionate skepticism of their article and not of mine, and then I could just LOL move on. It's fair. They should do more longer-term studies, for sure. Okay, let's keep doing that. That's probably being done. It takes time, though, so...
I am not surprised that kids who have been told that transition will solve their problems would then report shortly afterwards that it has indeed solved their problems. If you gave a 13-year-old a really ugly tattoo,
just so you know that it's 13 to 20-year-olds. So I mean, if I could find the breakdown of the kids that were 20 years old. Because I would feel let's say, because this is kids 13 to 20. So if we would say, let's say the 18 and 19 and 20 year olds, they had really positive outcomes, then, okay, yeah. I mean, they're old enough to make their decision. I get the 13 year olds, but they're not all just 13. There's some that are 20. So just keep it in mind. I mean, I'm interested to see how long-term it was based on the different ages.
It's pretty certain that he'd still think it was cool when he's 14.
Okay.
And if the 13-year-old gets a tattoo and then at 14 says, I still like this tattoo, it would be very stupid for you as an adult to say, well, look, see, it turns out getting the tattoo was a good idea. He's 14 and he still likes it.
Okay.
So the question is not how the 13-year-old feels at 14. The question is, how will he feel 5 years from now?
Sure.
10 years, 20 years. How does the adult version of the same child feel now that he has to live with the consequences of decisions that he made as a child?
I guess we'll find out when they get older. It's the unfortunate reality of doing these types of studies is that there are some people that are gonna not be, there are some people that are gonna be wronged by it. Unfortunately, that's how you experiment. The unfortunate reality, and I hate to say it, is the only way that we're gonna find out if the validity of gender dysphoria is if kids transition and then we see if they actually liked it afterwards. It's horrible because you shouldn't have to do that, but there's no other way to research it. It's just an unfortunate reality.
Regret is not likely to set in within the first year, though it very well might. Usually it takes longer. And you'll notice that many of these studies, they stop doing the follow-ups with the patients at precisely the moment when the regret might really start setting in. What we need are long-term follow-ups with people who transitioned as children. But as
Oh, listen, I don't know. I mean, this is probably maybe a little too much, but I looked up how long it takes for regret to set in, and it says a month to 6 weeks. I'm just saying, I don't know what you're just kind of saying words at this point, Matt. I mean, given the context, maybe that's not like inaccurate, but I don't know. It kind of just screams that Matt is just like saying anything he can.
I'm constantly having to explain, there aren't any reliable studies like that because we just started doing this to children on this scale very recently. So these kids are the test case. They are the guinea pigs.
Yeah, sure.
But anyway, you never answered my question. I asked for evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving. You shouldn't need a survey to tell me that. It should be a relatively easy thing to quantify.
How else would you quantify it, though, without a survey? I guess you'd call it a study. Wait, doesn't make sense. Like, come on. Like, even if you disagree with me, can we just realize how dishonest Matt's being right now? Oh, how do you quantify it? You need a survey? Yeah, that's how you quantify anything with data. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, oh, you need facts to quantify your information? You silly goose. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I personally enjoy facts. I enjoy studies. I think that they generally can be good. Of course, you should be skeptical of who performs them, but generally speaking, studies have pushed us forward as a society. I don't think that's a hot take. Okay, that's why people used to die from kidney stones, and now they just have to have an uncomfortable night in the hospital. We've done a lot. We've done a lot of good stuff.
There was no such thing as a puberty blocker until recently. And if these blockers are life-saving medications, then that would mean that billions of children lived at a time historically when the life-saving medication was not available to them. And
yeah, sure. Okay, this is a good... I think that this is a really interesting conversation, all right, which most of you probably won't. Now we're getting into the concept of like, okay, if we have this now and we didn't have it then what about those people back then? I think there's two things. One, they didn't have access to the treatment that they needed, and they probably did have really bad mental health outcomes. But it also gets into this really interesting conversation about availability of a solution versus non-availability of a solution and the way that your brain copes with shit like that. Let's say you lost your arm. You have a nub now. Okay, and that's your stroking arm. Okay? Because I hold my phone with the right, and then let's say society has, and that's just it. Your arm's gone, and you're like, okay, your brain's gonna cope because this is the only option that your brain has. I have no arm. I never will have an arm. I'm fucked. I got to deal with it. Now, let's say there was a magical pill that turns you into Piccolo from Dragon Ball Z, and you were able to grow your arm back. If you didn't have access to that Piccolo pill that grew your arm back, you would, considering the fact that there is still an option to have your arm grow back, then you know about it, you're probably going to be much less happy with the decision because there's multiple avenues that you could go down, right? You can have your arm back, but you can't because, oh, well, I don't have enough money for it. So now you're resentful because you don't have enough money. You're probably going to complain about the healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a really interesting mental perspective of people when they have different choices, how they will engage with those choices. Like there was a little study done where there's two groups of people and they got to pick a painting between A and B. Or we'll say 1 and 2. Group A, they were able to pick between 1 and 2, and then a week later they were able to change that pick. Group B, they had to pick 1 and 2, but they had to keep it after a week. They weren't able to change it. They found that Group B, who didn't have any more choices after they picked, they were happier with their decision because they had no alternative. They had no option. Their brain had to say, this is it, and they had to be reaffirming of the choice. And so we're kind of there. It's like one of those things where if there's like no availability of a particular treatment that exists, then you'll be happier because like this is the only route I can go down. But if there is an availability of another treatment and you can't do it, you're probably going to be more distressed in general, right? It's something to keep in mind. But then there's still going to be people who don't have access to this stuff that probably are more upset. You know, it's interesting because I was asked like, where did the tomboys go? You know, you were seeing fewer and fewer, like, you know, more butch lesbians and, or not even butch, but yeah, butch lesbians, or fewer and fewer, like, you know, femboy. Well, we're seeing more now on TikTok. But I think it's because historically, these are people that probably, given the choice, would have transitioned. But since they couldn't, that was the most that they could do in our society. But now that there's this option of availability of transition, mentally, they're like, oh, this is what I wanted. right? I remember I talked to a trans man a while back, one of my fans. It was a really nice conversation, and they were like, they had been for most of their life basically just a more like a tomboy. And then when that option of availability came up, that was like, oh, this makes sense. This clicks. So it's interesting. It's a fun thing to think about. So
that would mean that a great many children died because they didn't have access to it.
Maybe.
Okay, then give me some examples. Who died due to a lack of access to this life-saving drug?
Oh, you like trans people? Name every one of them.
You're saying it's life-saving. That should mean that many, many children have died because they didn't have access to it. So,
well, he showed us a study that showed that suicidality went down. So that means that you could consider it a life-changing study. I don't think that that's unreasonable.
Can you give me some examples? How many children died because there were no puberty blockers available?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
We should be able to see in history this enormous wave of child deaths due to a lack of chemical castration. Do we?
Okay.
I mean, I could quite easily point to deaths that happened because penicillin hadn't been invented yet, for example. So where are the...
Name them. I mean, I don't know what you want me to tell you. Like you can't, like, okay, like we don't do robust studies of like who would have died if we had access to this. Like in the Middle Ages, if we had penicillin, who would have stayed alive? We don't really judge things like that. We create the thing and go, wow, this could have been great 100 years ago. So there's really nothing he can point to for that. But okay, I mean, he points to the reduction in like suicidal thoughts. So
historical deaths that we can pin on a lack of puberty blockers.
Okay.
This is a life-saving drug. Isn't that what you said? Sure. Where's the historical evidence? Do you have even a single shred of it?
I mean, of course you don't. It has a little more than you in that, no offense, but you didn't even name your source.
That is interesting, though, that you can't bring yourself to endorse cross-sex hormones and surgeries for minors. At first blush, this would seem to make you slightly more reasonable than the other child sexual mutilation advocates.
Okay.
But upon further evaluation, it actually makes your position even more incoherent, if that's possible. After all, the very medical establishment that you trust implicitly when it comes to puberty blockers also says that hormones and surgeries can be life-saving medical interventions for children. So why do you trust them on the blockers, but not on the hormones and surgeries?
What? Hold on. I'm just arguing.
But upon further evaluation, it actually makes your position even more incoherent, if that's possible. After all, the very medical establishment that you trust implicitly when it comes to puberty blockers also says that hormones and surgeries can be life-saving medical interventions for children.
Does it? I've never seen that. My understanding is hormone and surgeries are reserved for 18 years old and up. So I don't even really know what he's referencing.
So why do you trust them on the blockers, but not on the hormones and surgeries?
This is the problem. Matt just doesn't really quantify anything that he says. Like, oh, is that like something that's like who's saying that children should get surgeries under 18? If it's happening, I've no problem with like seeing it. I'm just like, why? I just feel like you're just saying something without, like, you don't give us any proof of anything that you say. Like, give us like the National Trans Authority saying that 16-year-olds should have their tits cut off or something. You know, that's what I'm like. Give me something like that, and I'm fine with that. Like, okay, I'll take a look into it. You know, we could still disagree, generally speaking, and say like, oh, I think you should be 18 at the age of consent. That's fair. But yeah, I mean, what are you referring to?
If they're lying, or let's be very generous, catastrophically mistaken about the latter two, doesn't it stand to reason that the same would apply to the first? Blockers, hormone surgeries, they're all part of the same process of medical, quote, affirmation.
I guess.
What you're saying is that you agree with step 1, but you think they're wrong about steps 2 and 3. This might not be an insurmountable logical problem for you, except that the only reason you agree with step 1 is simply because you're taking their word for it. They claim that puberty blockers save lives, and you...
Well, they have studies, though, that prove it.
Believe them.
And you used another study that you felt proved it, even though like it was dated, and which is fine. And then you said their studies were bad, but yours was wrong, even though your criticism of their study could have been applied to your study. This is the problem here.
Well, why don't you believe the rest of the story they tell? And if you don't,
this is,
then have you considered that your skepticism should be more consistently applied? Third, finally, have you thought about just using your common sense? Has that thought occurred to you? You tried to rely on studies. That blew up in your face.
I mean, I don't think it did. You just kind of said study bad. It didn't really blow up in his face. You kind of made yourself look a little silly, but...
You want to appeal to authority, except that even you can't figure out whether you should trust these authorities or not.
But you did the same thing with another study that you wouldn't even reference because you're afraid of your own source.
You're all kinds of confused. You don't know which way is up, which way is down. Maybe consider applying your own mental faculties to this situation.
Although, in Matt Walsh's defense, Hunter did call him the pro-gamer word R-slur. So now Matt's just giving it back to him, but in a less ableist way.
Here's a very simple question. Does it make sense to you Does it actually make sense
Okay.
that a young boy might, in some sense, be a girl somehow,
Yeah.
necessitating the use of chemical castration drugs to suppress some of the physical effects of male puberty?
Yeah, it does. I just am very uncomfortable with it. So, like, if I look at something, I understand that like the brain is very complicated, and that it's possible, especially considering we do have intersex of the body, that somebody might be born with some kind of an intersex of the mind, which would be like gender dysphoria, and they may not actually be what they would in the right body. That does make sense to me. It does make sense. I can actually rationalize that. Am I uncomfortable with it? Of course. Well, I think it'd be silly if you weren't. Am I skeptical? Of course. But it does make logical sense, right? People are born with weird shit all the time. You know what I mean? Extra fingers and toes and different mental issues in general. People born with autism, ADHD, things that would be generally considered incongruent with our society. And so, yeah, I don't think it's too crazy, especially since, you know, this has been observed by a robust mental health care system. You know, it kind of makes sense. I could be uncomfortable with it, but
Does that proposition make sense? Does it make sense to take a boy who is male and try to alter,
what if the boy was female?
him in some way in an effort to make him into, or make it appear as though he has been made into, something he can never be?
Okay, I guess.
Does it make sense to medically affirm the boy's confusion? Rather,
That's not how we treat mental health. It's always like a silly talking point. It's unfortunate that Matt Walsh has a very low understanding of like mental health and how it works. We don't affirm somebody's confusion. The way that we look at every single, we'll say incongruency, it doesn't matter if it's a diagnosed mental health issue or whatever it is, but the way that we look at any incongruency at all is obviously we categorize them so that we can make it easier to treat. But what we do is we look at what's going on, we look at the issues associated with it, and then we look at what we could do to make that person best function in society without hurting society, right? So for instance, let's say a pedophile. Obviously letting them molest children is bad for society, right? So maybe you would actually want to legitimately medically castrate them. Let's say somebody with anorexia, because I know Matt likes to go to the anorexia route. Somebody with anorexia, if they eat less, they will die, right? If they feed into their idea that like they are too overweight, that they will pass away, unfortunately. For a trans person, if you look at the data that Hunter has shown us, those suicidality goes down if you help them transition, and their outcomes go up. You're trying to go the furthest away from death. I think that's the most basic way you can look at it. So, yeah. It's not treating a delusion. It's kind of just dealing with a particular issue that somebody has in the way that's best for them. In like a similar way where like if somebody has like ADHD or something, you might put them into a different class to help them have better outcomes in society, or somebody with autism, you'd have different like teaching protocols. You have a particular incongruency, and then you have solutions to make that incongruency less incongruent. It's really that simple. It's not about feeding into a delusion, right? So
rather than trying to treat and heal the confusion. I think you know that it doesn't. I think you're smart enough to know that it doesn't.
I think that if there, just so you know, there are people who like have gender dysphoria that like their treatment could be to just not transition. It depends on like it's a case by case basis. Most people do need to transition, but some don't. So
at least I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt on that point.
Okay.
A benefit that you perhaps haven't earned. Though you have earned your turn today, being, of course, canceled. And that'll do it for this.
Okay. What a segment. Interesting video. I wonder what Hunter's response will be.
I want Papa Gut to pee on my face, but just as a friend. There's nothing weird about that. I want him to pee on my face.